Welcome, everyone. I'm Beth Forsyth. I'm a co-chair of the Government Enforcement and Corporate Investigations Practice Group here at Dorsey. I'm in the Minneapolis office and really happy to welcome you here today. I thought that first panel was so informative and insightful and interesting. We're going to try to keep that going with this great panel. We're going to be talking about some recent developments in enforcement efforts and then also a lot on the compliance front. We've got some real compliance experts here. My practice is largely in corporate investigations, although I do a lot of compliance work around foreign bribery. So between the three of us, I think we'll bring some great perspective to some of the issues that we just talked about philosophically and bring it down to a detail level. With us today is Lisa Beth Lentini, all the way on my left. She's the CEO of Lumen Worldwide Endeavors, which is a firm that specializes in compliance, governance, and ethics consulting. She's an adjunct professor of law in the US and in the EU. Lisa Beth is a skilled global business partner who has led award-winning legal and compliance departments within large public corporations and in privately held companies. She's held corporate secretarial, legal, compliance, ethics, governance, and risk positions as an attorney at a Fortune 50 corporation, as the compliance leader of a global travel company operating in 150 countries, and as the corporate secretary, CCO, and co-chair of the Risk Council at a New York Stock Exchange listed company. Lisa Beth also served with the SEC in Washington, DC, both in the divisions of corporate finance and enforcement. Lisa Beth last year co-authored the book, Raise Your Game, Not Your Voice, How Listening, Communicating, and Storytelling Shape Compliance Program Influence. And I imagine she could talk a lot about the principles that we just heard about in the last panel. To my immediate left is Tara Shuchuk, and she's the relatively new, about 6 months ago, Global Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer at Medtronic. As most of this audience is well aware, Medtronic is a global healthcare technology company of 90,000 employees operating in more than 150 countries. Prior to her current role, Tara served in a variety of progressively responsible roles, including as Medtronic's deputy CCO, its ethics and compliance officer for Restorative Therapies Group, senior compliance director for Abbott's pharmaceutical division, and vice president of compliance, privacy, and security for a Chicago IDN. She's also held policy roles for several medical associations. For many years, Tara has published and taught courses in the areas of bioethics and healthcare compliance, and she's served as thesis advisor to LLM candidates. She's got a JD from McGill, an LLM in health law and policy from Loyola University in Chicago, and she completed a fellowship in clinical medical ethics at the University of Chicago. She also received the prestigious Medtronic Global Inclusion, Diversity, and Engagement, or GUIDE Award. Tara and her husband have been married for 29 years and love spending time with their 3 children. It's been a pleasure to get to know these women. I've known Lisa Beth for a long time, and I've just recently met Tara. We've had some great conversations to prepare for today's session. And out of those discussions, we've decided to focus on a few things. 1, anti-corruption enforcement trends. 2, what's been the corporate response? And what are compliance initiatives that we're seeing in-house? And then 3, what are investors pushing on by way of ESG factors? And anti-corruption is really an important ESG factor that investors are focused on. And we'll talk about what that is triggering companies to focus on. And then we'll try to wrap it up with some key takeaways. So as many of you know, with the new Biden administration in 2021, there was a renewed focus on some anti-corruption efforts. And in June of 2021, President Biden announced that he would be ordering an interagency review of anti-corruption efforts. And he wanted, by December of 2021, a multidisciplinary interagency report on how to fight corruption at a more holistic level. And what he got in December of 2021 was a lengthy report entitled, what's important to note about his June 2021 directive is that right in the title, he talked about how anti-corruption is a core US national security interest. And he wanted it framed that way so that it would really bring out the interagency focus. on fighting corruption. So by December of 2021, this lengthy memo came back, generally referred to as the 5 pillars memo. And you see those 5 pillars here that are aimed at curbing corruption and its deleterious effects. The first, modernizing, coordinating, and resourcing U.S. government efforts to fight corruption. Second, curbing illicit finance. So as we heard Professor Klaas talk about, all the money that's going from those red countries on the heat map, which we've got right here actually, and we'll talk about it in a minute, all that money going from those deep red countries to those light yellow countries. What are we going to do about that illicit finance piece? Third, holding corrupt actors accountable. Fourth, preserving and strengthening the multilateral anti-corruption architecture. And fifth, improving diplomatic engagement and leveraging foreign assistance resources to advance policy goals. These are huge initiatives. And, you know, there's been talk for years about what do we do outside of FCPA. So as most of you know, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the US prohibits any offers or attempts to pay or give anything of value to a foreign government official in order to obtain or retain business. It's been used to limit corruption in some huge ways, but it leaves a lot out, right? It leaves out the kleptocracy piece. It leaves out a whole lot of corrupt activity. And so this effort is really designed to be more holistic. Lisa Beth, what are you seeing as far as this interagency multidisciplinary effort playing out in financial services or elsewhere?
You know, it's interesting. I'm actually really glad that we had the conversation before about systems, because in anti-corruption, anti-fraud, there are some very interesting, you know, or strange bedfellows, right? What you see in places where there are heavy corruption are other really significant issues. In places with heavy corruption, you have heavy human trafficking concerns. You have heavy corruption throughout all sectors. It's not just, you know, one person. These are interconnected. And what we're seeing right now is a breaking down of some silos. Now, there will always be turf wars, for you know, for lack of a better term, between agencies. Agencies want to get credit for doing good work, but I am seeing quite a bit more collaboration and cooperation in terms of using the tools and resources that are available in multiple agencies to be able to get to the core issues. Now, every time that you're talking about corruption, you're talking about flow of funds. It's just the way that it works, because this has to be paid for. We are entering a new era where the attack vectors and the surface area of where this can happen is broadening rapidly. If you think about things like crypto, the metaverse, et cetera, you've got a whole new set of playing fields. So this cooperation, the breaking down of silos, I believe is happening. It is absolutely happening in the financial services space, with greater FFIC cooperation and collaboration, both in terms of examinations and in terms of enforcement activities.
And Tara, any notes on the 5 pillars memo? And I know you've got an introductory statement.
Yeah, and I just wanted to note that the views today are my own, you know, personally and professionally, just based on my experience over the years, and don't represent Medtronic. But I think with the Biden memo, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, even under the FCPA enforcement and cooperation internationally, as well as the Monaco memo. There are some flavors, you know, that we've seen in the past, and part of what remains to be seen is how much actually gets enforced, you know, especially if this is a one-term administration, how much do we actually see happening? But I think on the cooperation piece, we are already seeing it, aside from FCPA, we're seeing it domestically with some of the CARES Act enforcement. So, you know, the multiple trillions of dollars that went out the door over the last couple of years, the different elements of the administration from the enforcement perspective are really showing a lot of cooperative effort in enforcing against any potential fraud and corruption that happened, whether it was PPP or whether it, you know, is related to COVID testing and those sorts of things. So I think that theme of cooperation is definitely kind of living even in the moment.
And here is that Transparency International Corruption Perceptions Index heat map. They do this every year. It's a nonprofit that is aimed at fighting corruption. And it ranks 180 countries on perceived levels of corruption within their public sector. And the darkest red countries are perceived as most corrupt. The lightest yellow are perceived as the least corrupt. And we thought that we would show this in part to, give us some sense for where the action is in anti-corruption efforts globally, and also to lead into a discussion on Russia's invasion of Ukraine just for a moment. It's a great opportunity for us to talk about some of the ways in which corruption plays out in real life, right? And so you see here, Russia, big red country, upper right corner, they have been ranked in about the 130s out of 180 countries over the past 10 years or so. They've been hanging out there versus Ukraine, which has steadily risen up. They're not flying up the rankings. They're currently in 2021 at 122, but that's up from 146 in 2010. And there's been a lot of interesting articles written recently about how the transparency effort that Ukraine has undergone and how some of the anti-corruption measures that Ukraine has put in place domestically have actually driven Putin to the point where he decided to invade Ukraine. So you take things like basic functions of government that we take for granted here, government contracts being made public. That is something that before 2014 hadn't been done in Ukraine and had allowed for a lot of public corruption. They've implemented that, and that has led to the press being able to ask questions and uncover fraud and corruption. Another thing is the asset disclosure forms that elected officials have to complete that we also take for granted here in most instances. So again, these efforts that seem small, and they certainly haven't eradicated corruption from Ukraine, but they were building a foundation against corruption that was tying them more firmly to the West. And, a lot of these articles are positing that that posed a threat to Putin's vision of what the Russian constellation would look like going forward. Lisa Beth, talk to us a little bit about what you're seeing in the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Well, I mean, we could talk for days about what we can see from that particular invasion. One of the things that I think it's important to just observe is, in general, very deeply red countries on the Transparency International Index generally do not border yellowish countries. The exception that we see, if you look to the north in the Baltics, is countries that are now actually considering joining NATO because of a variety of what they view as threats to their existence. But what we're seeing right now in terms of corruption and what's going on in Russia is very interesting. As with any type of abscess, an abscess doesn't exist if there's drainage, right? So the more closed off a society is, the more likely it is to rot from the inside, right? Because there's no valve, right? There's no valve to make sure that there is a healthy environment. In Russia right now, I believe that there are a couple of things going on. Number one, it's been very clear that there has been some significant mismanagement and corruption within the military. They don't have up-to-date weapons in many cases. They have had significant logistics issues. Some of it, I'm sure we won't know for another 10 or 20 years, but what we can see is an overwhelming force, but yet difficulties in making much progress. I believe that as they mentioned on our last session, the professor was spot on that there's a vacuum of appropriate and well-considered information that's reaching top leadership within Russia. Now, the other things that we're seeing are that there's a lot of challenges for organizations around sanctions. The United States, Europe, and many other countries, Japan, et cetera, have decided to implement sanctions to try to express their displeasure and limit the resources that are available to continue this aggression. There are, for example, in pharma and med device, some exemptions to those sanctions. But what we're also seeing is that there are real challenges in terms of transportation, logistics, customs, insurance. And so Russia, we're kind of waiting to see exactly, this is a very interesting experiment in some respects, because we're not sure how this all plays out and how it plays out amongst the population. We think we have some ideas. We think that by putting on economic pressure, there is more likely to be some level of awareness that things aren't going right, because this is a population that is stuck with propaganda and not really clear visibility to other perspectives. So perhaps having economic sanctions will make people realize that something's going on in the world. But we are in the middle of this. We, I think, are at very early stages. And I think that over time, we will see what the corruption yields and also what the impact is to others within countries, right? I think that some of these oligarchs and people who are in positions of power feel very little of this in their day-to-day, because they are at a level and they have access to resources that the average person does not.
And Tara, how do you see the sanctions piece playing out from a corporate perspective as a leader in a company that operates around the world and has sanctions consideration?
Well, I think we, for the last couple of months, have been living through like a new sanction every day. So it's a complex weave, and it's highly challenging to just manage and understand how the different sanctions play out, where the exceptions are, and how you actually navigate them. And for a company like ours or anybody in the life sciences sector, as Lisa Beth mentioned, there are humanitarian exemptions, but there are yet still, additional challenges that we still need to navigate through, including, for example, a U.S. sanction that recently required no medical pharmaceuticals or devices could go directly to military purposes, so no military end users. And so how you actually figure that out and comply with that type of sanction in a very opaque market like Russia, where you're likely working with third parties and you're not even selling directly, is fairly complex and challenging to even know if you are in compliance. I think also what the weave of sanctions tell me is that there's a high opportunity for bribery and corruption. So as the complexity has increased to get products to market, you mentioned, Lisa Beth, the supply chain, even just getting a truck into the country, because there's other sanctions that kind of apply to that, or the banking SWIFT sanctions, name your sanction. Because it's so challenging, there will be workarounds. And so people who are looking to work around those sanctions are likely to engage in corrupt actions, bribery, et cetera, to make that happen. I'll have to make one other side note, because as Lisa Beth mentioned, the Russian military and probably the effects of corruption there on their ability to execute. As a student of history and a compliance geek, the immediate thing I thought about was the False Claims Act here in the United States. And the origins of that, of course, was the US Civil War, when Lincoln, passed that law because of all the substandard military, gear and equipment, et cetera, horses that weren't delivered, boots that were subpar, et cetera, which led to the False Claims Act. So, I think it kind of comes full circle as far as how, war can bring about corruption. And I just think that we're going to see more come out of this war from that perspective, aside from all the obvious humanitarian challenges.
And, I think that one of the things that we need to be aware of is, as you look at medical systems, right? So many of them are state-owned outside of, the United States, and it is really hard to differentiate. How do you make sure that you're selling to a hospital that is not serving the military? And then the other thing that has become really challenging is how many of these things, like things that use lasers, et cetera, become dual use and could be repurposed, whether it's because semiconductors are being repurposed or something else. And so I think companies are really struggling with this. And the other thing that I think is particularly interesting is when you look at sanctions, we've had sanctions going on for years and years and years, right? The ones that were implemented in like the 1960s against Cuba were far easier because we didn't have such a globally connected economy. The ones that were against, drug kingpins and, people who were proliferating weapons of mass destruction, those were very, very targeted. Crimea was, a series of sanctions that didn't have the same teeth that we're seeing right now with Russia and Belarus. So we are living in interesting times.
No doubt. Let's pull back now from that specific example and talk a little bit more about enforcement trends domestically over the past year. And in addition to the Biden 5 Pillars memo, Deputy Attorney General Lisa Monaco released a memorandum, as DAGs typically do, on enforcement priorities within the Department of Justice. And hers was released in October of 2021. And I've asked Tara to walk us through that.
Well, I'm sure many of you have read the memo, or at least, or maybe even attended the speech where she released it. And, as Beth mentioned, every DAG, every administration has a new memo. And so it's a little bit back to the future here, I think, with the Gates memo and bringing us back to some of the concepts around individual accountability for sure. Bringing monitorships, more fully back on the table. But the piece that I wanted to especially mention is the prior misconduct element that Monaco spoke to, because instead of similar conduct being considered or may be considered, she really broadened the net in ways that many are pushing back on. And I think the department is still figuring out exactly what they mean by this. But really broadening it to all criminal, civil, and regulatory misconduct, no matter where it came from, what sector, and even outside the jurisdiction of the United States and even the federal government, so state level and OUS misconduct potentially on the table. If you find yourself, sitting across the table from the DOJ, having to explain, prior misconduct, that net has widened considerably. From what Lisa Monaco has said. Now, how that's actually going to play out, I think, is a different story. But what that tells me from a compliance perspective is, the importance, especially when you're in a large multinational, highly regulated company or industry, that you will have prior misconduct. So you can't change that fact, or you will have at least settled about allegations of prior misconduct. The avoidance of litigation costs and fees, et cetera, largely, drive a lot of companies to settle. And so that history is there. And so when you find yourself in front of another enforcement action, really showing the strength of your compliance program. I mean, obviously, I'm here as a compliance geek, as I called myself. And I think we share that here on the stage, showing the effectiveness of your program and distinguishing the past allegations from the issue at hand is obviously been something that we've had to deal with in the past, but I think it's even going to be more important. And we're going to have to the aperture on it is going to be so wide. We're going to have to think about it very broadly. And so that whole element of an effective program to me just comes, even more to the front than ever. The other quick comment I'll make on the monitorships is, there really was a pullback, and the data, I was checking this out before the session, is that in the couple of years prior to the 2018 decision to kind of pull back on monitorships, there were about 20% of the FCPA related settlements had a monitorship associated with them, and then from 2018 to the present time, or the current administration, it was 10%. So basically they dropped by, about half. And so I would expect that we will see monitorships more fully back on the table with the new administration.
Yeah, and I, from my perspective, I think there's a couple of questions to be asking here. I am concerned about looking back at all criminal, civil settlements, et cetera, because they may not be pertinent at all to the misconduct that's being alleged, number one. And it basically is this catch-22, like, if you decide to settle something, it can and will be held against you, whether you admitted guilt or not, right? The other thing that is going on is there have been some ideas that have been floated about having chief compliance officers attest to the effectiveness of compliance programs at the end of monitorships. There's something like this has a very chilling effect on anybody's willingness to be able to put their name down and attest about the effectiveness of the compliance program. So I think that there's a number of different factors here. It'll be interesting, as you mentioned, to see how this will all play out long term, including what it does in terms of encouraging proper behavior and disclosures, especially voluntary self-disclosures, in light of this particular memo. Do you have anything else to add, Beth, on the?
I could. We'll move past it. I think this is a lot like the Yates memo. It's sort of, you said it right, Back to the Future. Offering up everything you've got on the individuals involved, that is as important as ever. I don't know that the companies really took their foot off the gas, despite the prior DAG memo saying that only those substantially involved in criminal conduct needed to be kind of turned over. And then, yeah, great points otherwise. So we haven't had a full year with the Monaco memo and the 5 pillars memo out to see, what impact, if any, that will have in day-to-day law enforcement. But throughout 2021, what we saw in the FCPA unit, so DOJ fraud section, FCPA unit, healthcare fraud unit, and then major frauds and market integrity units will cover developments in each of those 3, starting with the FCPA unit. The headline is enforcement by the numbers anyway was way down. If you talk to the prosecutors within the FCPA unit, they'll tell you they're making a lot of cases and you're about to hear about it. But we haven't seen it in 2021. So lowest number of enforcement actions in a decade in 2021. There were only 18 actions compared with 36 cases annually on average for the past 10 years. Of those, about more than half were in Latin America, with Brazil being number 1. The dollar volume of the fines was way down, less than 360 million. We're used to seeing billion-dollar years in recent times. And that's a 94% decrease from 2020 and the 3rd lowest in a decade. The individuals who were prosecuted for FCPA violations were not associated with corporations that also pled guilty or saw some kind of enforcement resolution, typically. And then one thing that's interesting, Tara, is this continued use of the ancillary tools, right? So the Travel Act and things that don't squarely prohibit the payment to foreign government officials, but rather the activities around that. What do you think is important there?
Well, just broadly speaking about the numbers going down in the FCPA, I don't rest easy at night with those numbers. Like it doesn't make me think as a compliance officer, like I don't need to worry about the FCPA anymore. And I have a colleague here in the audience and I know he doesn't worry less about the FCPA. I do think that it's a bit of an aberration and maybe a little bit of an administration transition that we saw in this past year. Because the use of ancillary tools, whether it's the Travel Act or the money laundering laws or other bribery corruption tools that the government has, I do think in addition to the FCPA are going to continue the cooperation, internationally that we've seen both the SEC and the DOJ use, I think is going to continue. And in fact, what we're seeing out of Russia, Ukraine, just to go back to that and sort of the international rallying together, the community rallying together, to me is a harbinger of this FCPA environment, continued international cooperation with regard to prosecuting, corruption and crime globally. The other thing I'll mention is just the finding of wrongdoing under the SEC side, books and records, or just the pure books and records element of FCPA versus any bribery actually being found or present. We started to see that, ticking up for sure in the last few years, and I expect that that will continue, which is obviously an easier bar to prove than proving bribery. And then just back to the cooperation piece, in the last 6 years, in the announced settlements, over 55 countries were included in sort of the pronouncements around cooperation in prosecuting corruption. So that's a lot of countries. And so again, I think we're definitely going to see that continue. I don't know if you want anything.
We can move on.
So really quickly, the Market Integrity and Major Frauds Unit has seen a lot of action around the CARES Act money that we talked about that's been flowing. Anytime there's that much money available, there's an opportunity for fraud. We just spent an hour talking about that with Professor Klaas. Lisa Beth, walk us through the first couple points, and then Tara, if you can cover the Boeing case, that'd be great.
Yeah, I think it's going to take like the next 2 decades to unwind everything that has happened in the last 2 years. I've heard that the PPP loan programs have been perhaps the biggest fraud in a generation. So far, only 178 people have been convicted, but I think that is just scratching the surface. I think we will start seeing more and more. When it comes to cryptocurrencies, what we know right now is billions are being stolen. And there are a whole variety of frauds, in addition to the fact that when you think about what's happening from a cybersecurity standpoint and ransomware, which we know has been, pervasive and attacking, every, group from the government over to utilities and other, critical sectors of the economy. Within this space, I would say what's old is new and what's new is old. Basically, this is just a different venue by which fraud can take place, and things like pumping and dumping, all of the different types of ways that you can defraud through phishing, those are all happening in the crypto space. And it's not as highly regulated as banking or the stock markets. So this is relatively rampant. And I think it is going to take us a little while to unwind it all. But I do think that's coming in the near future. In addition to that, I think that we're going to see a number of claims in the government procurement space, particularly around things like PPE, so personal protective equipment, some of the pop-up COVID testing, et cetera.
Yeah, and then just outlining on the Boeing case, I think we could have a whole session just on Boeing and sort of learning from the failures and the lessons learned and the follow-on litigations in that case. Because I think, again, as a student of compliance and ethics, and those two pieces I think are really important in a case like this. You see a lot of elements that, again, give us some good lessons learned. But essentially, Boeing had a pretty major settlement in the billions of dollars, as you see on the slide, around a fraud on the FAA, essentially not providing truthful information to the FAA. And then, interestingly, they attempted to prosecute one of the technical pilots, and so these were those that were testing the system, the MCAS system, and that was a trial that went to trial. So they were attempting to individually prosecute criminally one of these testing pilots for falsification of documents and that sort of thing. And the jury came back with an acquittal in that case. And so what that also tells me, and I want to talk to the governance piece in a second with the shareholders derivative suit, but that individual prosecution of the pilot is again, I think an example of how hard it is to prosecute individually. We just saw a couple of antitrust cases over the last couple of weeks as well that showed that those cases are tough for the government to prove. So as much as they want to achieve individual accountability, it's a very high bar for them. And I think this Boeing case tells us that as well. The piece that really interests me the most as a compliance professional, though, is the shareholder derivative suit. And I was watching this as it went through the Delaware courts because they were invoking, of course, Caremark all over the place with regard to, the role of the board and did the board get the right information? were they asleep at the switch, all of those sorts of things. And the case was moving forward. It sort of passed the Caremark test, and so it was moving forward. And then, of course, it got settled just in the fall for over $200 million, along with a number of changes that Boeing agreed to make. And some of those were actually already agreed to in their DPA. But among those were that they were to add a safety or aviation expert to their board immediately, but then in the future to add 3 more with sort of discrete expertise in these areas kind of related to their business, as well as create an ombudsman or an ombudsperson office. I could never really say that. And so they have to create this new office, which is really, kind of endemic, just this lack of a speak up culture that apparently was at the root of some of the issues in the case. And so creating this sort of overlay of a separate objective office to hear concerns and resolve them. And in addition, create a safety committee of the board. And if you look at some of the actually the case law that came out of Delaware on this case, you'll see, even some of the board members who were conversing back and forth, of course, the emails that are showing up in some of these documents with the CEO and other members of the management team around sort of the lack of having, focused efforts on safety discussions at a board level, and essentially, potentially not meeting that Caremark test of having sort of systems and controls and information flowing at the right level up to the board in areas that are of critical importance to the to the company, and obviously the safety issue with human lives at stake. So to me, the governance pieces around this case are fascinating and worthy of some additional looks and read.
Thanks, Tara. The healthcare fraud unit continues to see increased investment of dollars to fight fraud. That's been increased not exponentially, but incredibly, with all the money flowing around healthcare in the COVID space. And so there's that whole world. We've talked about that a little bit, that we could have a long discussion on that. Also interesting is that they're shifting more toward data analytics. And this has been going on for some time, but a really serious investment in data analytics. They've now got 7 dedicated analysts who are looking at the data coming into CMS and the data that's flowing through these government systems that is supporting asks for money and trying to take a look at whether there's fraud in those numbers from a really analytical approach. Tara, I'm going to come back to you on ECRA. What are you seeing there?
Yeah. What I find fascinating is this is a law that I actually didn't know that much about until recently. And it was passed in 2018 related to the opioid crisis. And so it essentially is like a shadow AKS, so a shadow anti-kickback law, but very focused on sort of the opioid treatment recovery centers. The element of it that I think is, if you're not in that treatment of opioid or substance abuse space, more broadly, it applies to laboratory testing. So there's an element of this law that is very expansive around laboratory testing. And so essentially it's an anti-fraud law around lab testing with that doesn't have some of the safe harbors, for example, that the anti-kickback law has. And also in many ways is more, it's more of a heavy hand than the anti-kickback law in the sense of the penalties that can accrue. So to me, it's an expansion. It also, the one key element that I forgot to mention is that it expands beyond federal healthcare program dollars. And so unlike the anti-kickback law, which is very focused on federal healthcare spending, this law it potentially gets, and it does get into the commercial space. And so anybody who is in the lab, side of the world, I think you need to pay attention to ECRA, and certainly with the COVID testing that's been happening over the last couple of years, I think we're going to be seeing ECRA come into play with that.
So shifting from enforcement to compliance and sticking with the healthcare life sciences field, and then we're going to broaden out from there. What is happening in life sciences from a compliance standpoint that can help us broaden out and better understand some of the principles in the corporate response?
Mm-hmm. Well, we have up here the special fraud alert that the OIG published back in 2020, and also some notations to a couple of recent settlements that CMS had with companies around the open payments or the sunshine, transparency law. And I mention these because, again, as we're thinking about coming out of the pandemic, these are very much, at least the first piece, the OIG fraud alert is very much centered on not just transfers of value and potential kickback risk in what are called speaker programs, so training programs, education programs with physicians or other customers that are sponsored by life sciences companies, pharma or device, and that are those types of events really. One purpose of those events is as a kickback or an inducement for them to purchase the products. And so what part of those programs could be an inducement? Well, it could be the speaker fees. It could be the meals or the entertainment. The alcohol was a big piece that came out in this fraud alert. There were 9 different suspect factors that the government looks at and outlines in this fraud alert. But what this fraud alert tells us as a compliance group is that the government is looking certainly at these dollars. And in particular, they put a stake in the sand and they said, you know what, since we've been in a pandemic, these programs have gone virtual. When we go back to non-pandemic life and you start to bring people back together for these training programs, these speaker programs, and you're having them in person, we are going to consider that suspect. And that's essentially what they say in the fraud alert. And so that puts off a lot of red alarm bells to those of us who in life sciences industry believe that there's actually value and benefit to these types of programs. And so how do you protect them and make sure that they are appropriate? I think it goes back, as you said, Beth, to the 7 elements of a program. Right. How do you ensure that they are legitimate, appropriate, fair market value, all of those sorts of things?
Well, and broadening out, and I'm going to ask Lisa Beth to walk us through these 7 elements and remind us what we're talking about here, big picture. But if the government is going to take the position that because for 2 years we made everything work virtually, then we must continue to do that, or we're going to, apply extra scrutiny to anything that's done live for purposes of corruption analysis, kickbacks, et cetera. That's a really tough bar. We advise clients all the time in the FCPA space. If you can justify paying for a customer's trip to see your facility, to have a live meeting, and then in conjunction with that, you're also going to a football game or whatever, that's part of showing them the product. That's part of demonstrating what you can do for them. And that's legitimate. Are we going to enter a new world where because we could, hold our phone up and walk through the factory, that anything else is corrupt? Is a world that I'm not sure we're ready for. And that, I think there's going to be a lot of pushback. So Lisa Beth, why don't you walk us through?
I will just add in as a parent, I can tell you from personal experience that virtual school is not as effective as having a particularly young students engaged in interacting with other learners, right? And I think many people who have had visits with physicians, like in the normal course of things, like it's fine if you're checking in, but if you have a problem, you don't want, your life support available via Zoom. I think we're going to have to find a happy medium here. Just because you can have meetings entirely virtually doesn't mean that you should, or that is as effective. So we did want to spend just a moment to talk about some of the hallmarks of a compliance program, because we know that not everybody is geeking out like we are in this space. And, one of the things that you should look to is the Department of Justice guidance, the SEC statements on this, the OFAC guidance on what constitutes an effective compliance program. But you'll typically find for most organizations, they can fit into 7 buckets, 7 pillars. Although there are some additional areas such as mergers and acquisitions that may or may not apply depending on the organization that you're dealing with. But essentially, they're standards, written policies and procedures. Do you have a code of ethics? How is this put together? Oversight, where's the board in this? Do you have a person who is responsible for your compliance program? Or is it a group effort, like a team project where no one's actually in charge. Training and awareness, making sure that there's good communication, education, et cetera, that happens at the right time in a way that connects with people. Reporting, how are you making sure that information is traveling in the way that it needs to? And that includes having a hotline, particularly obviously for any public companies, but also for private organizations and nonprofits. This is becoming far more common that there will be an independent third-party run hotline that often, depending on the jurisdiction you're in, allows you to report anonymously. Monitoring, making sure that you're doing risk assessments, auditing, making sure that there's continuous improvement, ensuring that there's organizational justice when it comes to enforcement and discipline. If X person does one thing and Y person does the exact same thing, but X person is a great performer, are the outcomes going to be the same? Or is there someone who is tipping the balance of the scales? And finally, response and prevention, making sure that you're detecting and going through that corrective action and remediation process. We could spend hours on this too, but we won't because there are more interesting things to move on to, including ESG. I'm sure that you probably have heard or read about ESG at this point in time. It has gone by many other names in the past. ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. And it covers a whole range of topics that stakeholders, and you'll note I specifically don't say shareholders because stakeholders is a far larger group, consider important. The reason we're talking about stakeholders is Business Roundtable a couple of years ago decided to come up with a relatively new definition of what is the purpose of an organization, what is the purpose of a corporation. Previously, it had really focused on profit for shareholders. That was the 1980s view, right? The purpose of a company is to make money for its shareholders. Now, the going definition coming out of the Business Roundtable is the purpose of an organization is to serve many stakeholders. That includes the employees who are part of the secret sauce of almost every corporation. It includes the communities that you operate in. It includes your relationships with governments. It includes the people who invest in your organization and people who may be consumers or somehow interested. So I included the framework from SASB, which due to a variety of mergers and acquisitions is part of the Values Reporting Foundation. But essentially, they divide the universe of sustainability issues into kind of 5 key groupings. And you'll see when you look at these, there's actually a lot of things that you're concerned about from a litigation and risk perspective, as well as areas that your compliance program or your human resources group may already be covering in varying degrees, whether it's diversity, equity, and inclusion, or whatever your acronym is that may include belonging, or it's human rights, which oftentimes crosses over between multiple groups, including procurement, human resources, compliance, legal, et cetera. So one of the things to know is that as you survey the landscape, there are a number of different ESG funds out there. And the SEC has put out a number of alerts about making sure that you know what you're investing in and for those ESG funds to make sure that they're following through on what they say they're going to do and voting in alignment with the commitments that they've made to the groups that are, to the people that are investing in them. Right now, flows into ESG funds in the third quarter of 2021 were about $51 billion. And the global fund assets, they are estimating, are at about $2.7 trillion. So there's a lot of money going into this space. There is also a lot of greenwashing and other forms of manipulation or false information that's being provided because there's not a lot of regulation around what groups are disclosing. The thing that most asset managers are concerned about when it comes to ESG is of the factors that are out there, financial advisors are most concerned about companies' anti-corruption efforts. And that's the link. It's a little bit long, but that's the link to fraud and corruption, because we know that organizations that have problems with corruption, that have problems with fraud, generally end up with fines and fees, do not perform as well, right? There is a premium for ethical, values-based behaviors, both in terms of the stock price and in terms of the likelihood that an organization's not going to run into problems. So things that you should know. There's a lot going on with the SEC in this space. There's a lot going on with ESG. They have a climate change rulemaking proposal out right now. It's over 500 pages long. It's a really great read. They have disclosures around cybersecurity and breaches that are on the table. And human capital has been another area that they've been keenly interested in and requiring disclosure. Corruption's been around for a long time. It remains a material issue for investors because, according to a PwC estimate, about $1 trillion is paid out in bribes each year, and over $2.6 trillion is lost to corruption. According to the Principles for Responsible Investing, they say corruption may add 10% to the cost of doing business on average, and that in developing nations, procurement contracts can be impacted by over 25%. So I think we're going to see a little bit more attention based on, the Biden 5 pillars, and also the interests of ESG stakeholders across the board. So as we think about this, we've already talked a little bit about the SEC regulations in regard to climate-related risk, cybersecurity, human capital. I think that we're going to see quite a bit more discussion around supply chain and third-party risk. I also believe that we will see more reporting and books and records issues around conflicts, gifts, and entertainment. That's where I think there's a convergence of what we were talking about before with, do you really need these programs for speakers? And is that going to create conflicts of interest, gifts and entertainment, or books and records problems? I also think that we're going to see quite a bit of effort by groups like the UN to try to crack down on some of this. The UN Global Compact includes a principle requiring corporate and organizational anti-corruption initiatives for the prevention of corruption, extortion, and bribery. They're expecting that of organizations, and I think we need to be aware and ready for that. I know we're running a little low on time, and I want to make sure we have an opportunity to move on.
Well, and Tara, so a question to you, kind of getting at this second point on this slide. ESG is now on the radar. From a compliance standpoint, you have this huge wheel of additional factors, some of which have long been addressed, but some are new and they're taking on new importance within an organization. You've got the cyber issues that have been discussed. How, in an era of constrained resources, how do you prioritize? How are you thinking about this?
Well, I think in any good compliance program, you do a risk assessment, and that is a core component of how you manage your resourcing and your focus areas. But I think beyond that, especially as you think about ESG coming to the fore with SEC rules, in the pipeline, how do you structure something like your ESG representations around like a framework, like a 7 elements compliance program, so that you're not just sort of ad hoc creating statements about your sort of ESG commitments or some of those pillars within the ESG framework, but you're actually backing it up by documentation and maybe testing and monitoring. I mean, again, those core elements of the framework of a strong compliance program, I think you can overlay into a new area like ESG. Now, whether that's the compliance function doing it, to your point about sort of many things to do and not enough time or people, or whether it's another component of the organization, I think the partnership that any compliance function has with other, teams within a large company, for example, whether it's your quality organization, your investor relations group, your governance teams, your HR departments. I mean, I think all of these different risk factors, your security office, you have to really, not necessarily own it all, but look to partner and make sure that the risk is being covered, and then offer your expertise where it's necessary and important.
And we're always looking for opportunities to express the value of compliance, right? And the dollar volumes that Lisa Beth just referred to of investment going into ESG funds and heading toward companies that are doing this stuff right, I do think presents us with an opportunity to make that value pitch internally to say, listen, we know we're a cost center. We know we're asking for resources to tick and tie certain things and document certain processes. There's a payoff, right? Potentially, and in a world where we're always looking for anything we can do to express the value that works potentially. So, in closing, run us through a couple of key takeaways that the folks here and online should take with them.
Yeah, I'll start out with, as with anything, follow the money. The money is going to be where you're going to have problems. And, I think we're in an era where there is less cooperation from certain governments than there has been historically, although many of the governments that we're getting less cooperation from weren't very cooperative to begin with. But following the money really allows you to understand where the risk is, right? There has to be funding for there to be corruption in one way, shape, or form. And it can be through influence and things like that. The job programs for officials' children, but follow where there's compensation. The three elements of a traditional fraud triangle are opportunity, pressure, whether it's an incentive or some type of motivation, and the third element is rationalization or justification, attitude, culture, whatever you want to call it. So look at those three elements and say, is there an opportunity? Is there some form of pressure? And is there a way that you can make this seem all, fine, whether it's through propaganda or other means? Just be aware that that still holds true even in this environment.
The couple of things I would pull out on the slide here are culture and the governance piece. And I think drawing a line from Professor Klaas's concepts earlier, they really resonated with me because I think the systems and the culture are so important within a company. You can't have a rule for everything. And if somebody wants to do something wrong, they will work around and they will find a way to work around a rule. And so I'm mindful of a great quote that I have on my wall at office from Warren Buffett. And he says, when you look to hire someone, you look to hire for integrity, intelligence, and energy. And if you don't have the first one, integrity, the last two will kill you. He has a couple other variations on that quote, but it really rings true. And so that intake process of making sure you have the right people and that you're taking actions against those that aren't doing the right things, I think sends a really strong message to the organization.
And I'll just follow on that. Once they're in the door, once you have the right people, again, to draw a connection to Professor Klaas's point, keeping them in a system where you are staying in touch and continuing to understand what's important to them and relay back to them what's important to the organization, and that feedback loop, it can't be replaced, and it can't be done as well in Zoom. Final thought. Thanks a million for being here. Jay, do you want to send us on our way? Yes. Or for those of us here, back to the happy hour we're going to have?
Well, thank you again for those of you who dialed in for the webinar. We really appreciate your being here and being a participant. And those of you that appeared personally, thank you so much. We do have a little gathering planned for you. If you can stick around, even if it's just for a few minutes or longer, that would be wonderful. Special thanks to our speakers outside of Dorsey, to Professor Brian Klaas, Lisa Beth Lentini, and Tara Shuchik. Thank you so much for your really terrific comments and observations. We do send out emails to all participants, whether appearing by electronics or in person, to allow you to anonymously give an evaluation of the program. We do read those, and they are important to us, and they help us to plan for the future. So if you get the email and you have the opportunity to fill it out, we'd really appreciate it. And again, I think that for those of us in person, if you sign the sheet, you'll get your CLE credit. For those who appear remotely, the QWR codes are important as well. So thank you for attending. Really appreciate it. And we look forward to seeing you next year.